Welcome to a Sherlock Holmes mystery. A midnight knock, a veiled widow, and a husband's death buried in snow. A serpent's seal, a whispering lake, and 5 guests with something to hide. But justice unearths deeper tunnels where the dead still walk, and the whistle never stops. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Tell us below. It was upon a raw and bitter December night, one in which the wind prowled through Baker Street like a starving hound, that our adventure began. The fire in the grate of 221B had burned low, throwing long, restless shadows across the walls. Holmes sat in his accustomed armchair, a black silhouette against the amber glow, his long fingers steepled before his face. His pipe, long since gone out, hung forgotten between his lips as his mind pursued some private labyrinth of thought. Outside, the snow drifted softly upon the gaslit street, muffling the rattle of distant carriages. I had been reading quietly, half drowsing by the warmth, when a sudden knock broke the silence. It was not the timid tap of a casual caller, but a rapid, desperate pounding, urgent and uneven, as though delivered by a trembling hand. Holmes's eyes gleamed at once. "Watson," said he, rising swiftly, "you will observe that our visitor comes at an hour when respectable society is abed. It is now precisely 12 minutes past midnight. Few knocks sound so fevered at such an hour without tragedy pressing close behind them." Before I could answer, Mrs. Hudson's footsteps were heard below, followed by the opening of the door, and a voice low, strained, unmistakably female. Moments later, our landlady entered, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "She says it's urgent, Mr. Holmes. The poor lady's near frozen to the bone." Holmes motioned her in. The woman who stepped across our threshold was draped in a thick black veil, the kind worn by widows in deep mourning. Her cloak was flecked with snow, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her. Even through the dim light I could see that she trembled, not merely from cold, but from fear. "Pray be seated," said Holmes, his tone softened by that rare sympathy he reserved for the truly distressed. "You have come to me for help, madam. May I know your name?" She hesitated a moment before lifting her veil. Her face was pale, refined, and marked by sleepless grief. "My name is Mrs. Clara Vane," she whispered. "I am, or rather, I was the wife of Captain Leonard Vane of the Royal Engineers. He died last Christmas Eve." Holmes inclined his head gently. "My condolences, Mrs. Vane. Yet I presume that your visit tonight suggests that your husband's death is not as simple as the world believes?" She gave a shuddering breath. "It was said to be an accident. But I know, Mr. Holmes, I know that Leonard was murdered." There was a silence, thick and sudden, as the clock upon the mantel ticked into the void between her words. Holmes's eyes gleamed sharply through the rising haze of his rekindled pipe. "Pray continue," said he. Mrs. Vane clasped her hands together, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Last year, we were guests at the estate of Sir Geoffrey Mallory in Surrey, a Christmas house party of officers and their wives. My husband had been working on a confidential project for the War Office, something involving fortifications on the Channel coast. He was uneasy, secretive, and fearful. On Christmas Eve, he went for a walk after dinner and never returned. They found him the next morning by the frozen lake, his neck broken in a fall, they said. Holmes' brow furrowed. "And yet you suspect foul play?" "Yes, because last week on the anniversary of his death I received this." She reached into her cloak and drew out a small envelope. Its seal was black wax, unbroken. Holmes examined it under the lamplight with that feline grace of his. The envelope bore no address, only her name written in a spidery hand, Clara Vane, widow. On the back, pressed into the wax, was an impression of a holly branch, and curiously a serpent twined about it. Holmes slit it open with his penknife. Inside lay a folded sheet, upon which was written only one sentence in a cramped, slanted script. "The one who killed your husband will come knocking again this Christmas Eve." Mrs. Vane's voice broke into a sob. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve, Mr. Holmes. Tonight I came because I could bear the waiting no longer. Holmes placed the note gently upon the table. He turned to me with eyes alight with purpose. Watson, I fancy we have little time to waste. A widow who receives a death warning on the anniversary of her husband's supposed accident, and sealed with a serpent and holly symbols, both of deception and winter renewal. The combination is most singular. Then he addressed Mrs. Vane once more. Tell me, madam, who among that Christmas company stood to gain by your husband's death? She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the fire. There were 5 guests that night. Sir Geoffrey Mallory, our host, his niece, Miss Eliza Stone, Colonel Fortescue and his son, Edward, and, she stopped, her lips trembling, and Major Lionel Draycott. Holmes leaned forward. Ah, you paused upon that name. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Major Draycott was once my suitor before I married Leonard. I believe he still resented my choice. Holmes smiled thinly. Jealousy, the oldest motive in the world, but jealousy alone seldom leads to murder. He stood and reached for his coat. Watson, fetch your hat. We shall call upon Sir Geoffrey Mallory's estate before dawn. But Holmes, I protested, it's miles from here, and the snow precisely. My dear fellow, the snow preserves truth better than any witness, and somewhere in Surrey, beneath that same frozen whiteness, lies the footprint of a killer who thinks himself beyond reach. He turned to Mrs. Vane. Courage, madam. Before the next midnight strikes, we shall know whether your husband's ghost knocks again, or whether the living hand behind it shall be caught in the act. The hansom bore us to Charing Cross through a world muffled in white, and by 1:30 we were steaming southward, the carriage lamp swaying with the rhythm of the rails. Holmes spoke little. He kept the serpent and holly seal between finger and thumb, turning it toward the light as a jeweler studies a flawed gem. An amateur chooses skulls, he said at last. A serpent wreathed in winter leaves is the work of a mind that thinks in emblems. It is not merely a threat, it is a thesis. We alighted at the village station before dawn and took the lane to Sir Geoffrey Mallory's estate, where snow lay crisp upon hedge and gate, and the air cut like a whetted blade. A groom, blinking with sleep, admitted us by a side door into the library. Sir Geoffrey, spare, erect, with the cropped moustache of service, received us with a courtesy that did not hide his disquiet. The fire had fallen to a red cavern, yet, upon the escritoire, a blot of wet ink shone like a pupil. Holmes drifted there and, with a touch delicate as a moth's wing, turned the blotter. Someone wrote here after the household retired, he murmured. He bent to the hearth, lifted the poker, and frowned. Green along the iron copper salts from dyed tapers. Do you burn such candles? In the great hall only, said Sir Geoffrey. We keep the library plain. We were quiet after 10. Miss Stone had a headache. I nodded here before the fire and went up. Holmes set the poker down and let his hand pass under the lowest shelf of the bookcase. Dust lay even as sifted flour, save for a lane the width of a lantern's base, where the wood showed faintly oiled. He pressed a seam. A small panel yielded, revealing a shallow niche, a hiding place for light. He said, closing it with a click. Who uses this room when the household sleeps? Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Miss Eliza Stone entered with a shawl drawn close, the pallor of a sleepless vigil lending her eyes a fevered luster. You will go to the lake? She asked, glancing towards the window where darkness thinned. Mrs. Vane said you would begin there. Presently, said Holmes. Who keeps the lanterns? Mrs. Keene, the housekeeper, and Thomas, the stable boy. Her gaze flitted involuntarily to the escritoire. Holmes's eyelids drooped a fraction, as though data had settled into place. Have the household assembled at 8, if you please. We shall disturb the snow first, while it is most honest. The east had paled to a bruise when we crossed the lower meadow. The lake lay like a white shield ringed with bare beaches, a small boathouse crouching at its northern lip. The ice groaned faintly under winter's bit. Holmes moved with that feline economy that belongs to him alone, breath scarcely a plume upon the air. "Here," he said at the boathouse rail. A greasy film marred the wood. He touched and sniffed. Common paraffin with a trace of fish glue. A lantern was seated here last night with some care. He knelt at the threshold, where wind-scoured snow had preserved a palimpsest of marks. A man waited note the shallow crescents where the heel rocked and shifted often. Nervous or cold, he scraped grey upon his knife from the ice's roughened edge. Trichinopoly ash, not expertly smoked, the wrapper has torn in lighting. And, see the twin bruises upon the post, rope wear from old use, renewed of late. "Good heavens, Holmes," I cried, "is this connected with Captain Vane's death?" "Connected, assuredly," he answered. "Last night retraced a path once taken. Stand here with a lantern and throw a beam slantwise. That reach appears a sheet of steel to the window of the library. Coax a man to trust it, and the thin ice by the reeds will do the rest. Rehearsal is the coward's refuge." We followed the bank until the prints surrendered to the glazed surface. Holmes marked 2 points with his stick, cited an imaginary line to the house, and gave a single satisfied nod. The stage and the lighting are set. We lack the prompter. By the time we regained the house, Mrs. Keene had laid coffee in a small morning room. Holmes warmed his hands and addressed her with unexpected gentleness. "You sat up late," he said. "Your knitting keeps the smell of lamp oil and glue." She colored and confessed that Thomas had dropped the Southfield lantern. She had mended the hinge and replaced it by 11. "At the boathouse?" asked Holmes. "Aye, sir. Have you any black sealing wax?" "None, Mr. Holmes." He simply nodded. "Send Thomas to me, if you please." At 8, the household gathered. Sir Geoffrey, Miss Stone, Colonel Fortescue, thick-necked and florid, his son Edward, smooth-faced and restless, and last, Major Lionel Draycott, whose moustache bristled like a saber guard and whose eye appraised Holmes as one duelist another. Holmes stood a little apart, studying them as a naturalist might rare birds. "I ask but trifles," he said mildly. "Permit your boots to be sent for cleaning, and give Dr. Watson a plain account of your movements upon last Christmas Eve, corrected to the quarter hour." Sir Geoffrey bristled. Holmes's smile was thin. "The snow, Sir Geoffrey, is a meticulous witness." When the boots had been carried away, Holmes returned to the library and bent over the blotter. Through his lens, a reversed ghost of writing emerged, a cramped line with a curious tail to the letter V. "The hand that warned Mrs. Vane," he murmured, and a second message, meant to leave no paper behind. He glanced once more at the oiled niche. Foreign wax, copper-dyed tapers, a lantern set to throw a faithful lie across treacherous water. "Our emblem grows eloquent, Watson. Now let us hear whether memory is as faithful as the ice." The interview of recollections began in the breakfast room, where the frost upon the windows turned the light to dull silver. Holmes placed himself with his back to the hearth, his keen gaze sweeping the semicircle of faces. "You will pardon the method," he said, "but precision is the courtesy of truth. I shall note the hour and sequence of each statement. You may correct me as I go." Sir Geoffrey spoke first. "After dinner last Christmas Eve, about 9:30, Captain Vane proposed a stroll. The night was clear, the moon bright on the lake. We parted at the door. I remained in the smoking room with the Colonel and Major Draycott until midnight. We heard nothing until the morning." Holmes inclined his head. "The window of the smoking room faces the north terrace?" "Indeed." "And was the moonlight sufficient to mark a moving figure upon the ice?" "I believe so." "Yet you saw none?" "No." Colonel Fortescue cleared his throat. "I recall hearing the boathouse door creak about 11. Thought it was the wind." "The wind seldom smokes at Trichinopoly," murmured Holmes. and the colonel's ruddy face darkened. Young Edward spoke next, his voice unsteady. "I retired early. Miss Stone can confirm it. I was ill from the punch." Miss Stone's hands were clenched in her lap. "He did go up, Mr. Holmes. I saw him on the stairs." "Before or after you extinguished the lamps?" Holmes asked. "After, I think. Memory, Miss Stone, is like glass clearer when cold. You will recall precisely before we leave this house." Major Draycott's turn came last. Captain Vane went out for air. I wished him a good night and thought no more of it. When he failed to return, we searched at dawn. The ice had broken near the reeds. His body was beneath. Tragic, but plain enough. Holmes's gaze lingered upon soldier's smooth gloves. Plain, yes, as a polished mirror until one sees what it reflects. He turned to me. "Watson, observe the pattern of testimony. Each gentleman fixes his alibi upon the hour when the house slept, yet the house itself speaks of wakefulness. We shall let it tell its story." He requested the household disperse, save for Sir Geoffrey, and walked once more to the library. Taking from his pocket a small magnifier and a thin wire, he probed the seam of the niche discovered earlier. A click sounded. The panel slid back to reveal a lantern, its wick still scented with glue and oil. And beside it a stub of candle the color of tarnished copper. Holmes lit the lantern briefly, shielding it with his hand. The flame cast a sheet of light across the window, striking the frozen lake beyond with a cold gleam. "You perceive, Watson, that a man lured from the house would see smooth ice where death waited beneath." He closed the panel and addressed Sir Geoffrey. "This contrivance is no rustic fancy. The mechanism is brass, made to pattern naval or engineering work. Captain Vane served the Royal Engineers, I think." "Indeed. Then someone close to him borrowed knowledge as well as hate. I must see his papers." Sir Geoffrey led us to a small study adjoining the guest wing. The air smelt faintly of camphor and dust. Holmes moved at once to the writing desk. "Locked? Excellent." He drew a slender blade from his watch chain and raised the lid. Inside lay a neat array of letters, a compass, and a notebook bound in calfskin. He turned the pages swiftly, pausing only to study a crude sketch of fortifications and a ciphered list of names. So, Mallory, Fortescue, Draycott. And one entry circled in pencil, Ashford Lime Company. "Do you know it?" Sir Geoffrey frowned. "It's a quarry near here. Closed these 3 years. Closed businesses often shelter open secrets," Holmes murmured. He slipped the notebook into his pocket. "We will visit it before nightfall." As we left the study, we encountered Mrs. Vane upon the landing. Her eyes searched Holmes's face. "You have found something?" "Only that the past keeps its breath upon the glass," he said gently. "We shall see what pattern the frost reveals by dusk." The remainder of the day passed in inquiry. Holmes examined the stable boots sent for cleaning, comparing the nails and clinging earth with samples taken near the lake. At one pair, the colonel's he scraped a residue of greyish clay flecked with lime. "From the quarry, unless I mistake," he whispered. "And yet our colonel swears he has not left the estate in weeks." Curious. By late afternoon the sky had darkened to pewter. Holmes and I set out through the drifts toward Ashford Quarry. The wind moaned in the pines like an organ. The gates hung, rusted and half open. Inside, the pit yawned white and silent. Its floor rimed with ice. Near a collapsed shed, Holmes stooped and drew from the snow a boot print marked by a missing heel stud. He compared it with an impression in his notebook and nodded. The same pattern as Fortescue's pair, lacking the right rear nail. The man who heard the wind came here to hide something. He moved toward the shed and struck a match. The flame showed a crate half buried under timber. Within lay sodden paper wrapped about a small metal box stamped with the crest of the War Office. Holmes broke the corroded clasp. Inside was a plan of coastal defenses, water-stained yet legible. "Watson," he said softly, Our captain died not for love nor vengeance, but for silence. Someone feared what he knew. A cry echoed from the quarry's rim. We turned sharply. A figure fled into the snow, cloak whipping behind. Holmes caught my arm. Back to the house quickly. The serpent stirs before the frost is done. Tonight, my dear Watson, the lake will have its second ghost if we do not prevent it. We reached the estate breathless, the dusk deepening into a violet gloom. Lamps glowed through the drawing-room windows, casting trembling reflections upon the snow. Holmes strode swiftly across the gravel, his long coat flaring behind him, and entered without ceremony. The household had gathered around the hearth, Sir Geoffrey, pacing, Mrs. Vane seated pale and rigid, Miss Stone whispering comfort. Colonel Fortescue stood apart, his heavy jaw clenched, while Major Draycott leaned against the mantel with an ease too deliberate to be genuine. Holmes gave one of his rare bows. I regret my abrupt return, but events urge haste. A word with you all, if you please. He removed his gloves with meticulous calm. We have visited Ashford Quarry. There we found a metal case bearing the War Office crest, containing plans of fortifications known only to Captain Leonard Vane and, perhaps, to one other among you. Gentlemen, the theft of those plans was the motive for your comrade's death. A murmur rippled through the room. Draycott straightened. Are you suggesting one of us is a traitor, Holmes? Holmes smiled faintly. I suggest only that treachery walks in respectable boots, Major, but we deal in proof, not suggestion. Colonel Fortescue, would you oblige me by showing your right boot? The colonel's brows knitted. What is the meaning of this charade? The meaning, Holmes replied, lies in a quarry print I found this afternoon, lacking the rear stud of the right heel precisely as yours. Fortescue's hand tightened on the back of a chair. Coincidence, he muttered. Coincidences, said Holmes evenly, are the refuge of those without imagination. The residue of lime upon your soles confirms your journey to the pit. There you concealed the stolen plans, your payment, no doubt, for silence. You feared Vane would expose you. The colonel's ruddy color drained. He suspected nothing, he stammered. It was Draycott who... Draycott's laugh cut him short. You old fool, he hissed. You should have burned them. Holmes's gaze flickered between them, satisfied. Ah, an admission before the curtain drops. Yet there remains one point of drama, and that must be played tonight. You see, gentlemen, the warning sent to Mrs. Vane was not intended as cruelty, but as concealment. The murderer, fearing discovery, sought to create alarm that would draw attention elsewhere. But fear is an untrustworthy ally. It makes men repeat their crimes. He turned to Mrs. Vane, whose eyes widened with dread. You must have courage, madam. The man who sent that note intends to strike again tonight, at the hour your husband died. But we shall be waiting. She clutched the arm of her chair. Mr. Holmes, you mean he will try to kill me? Possibly, Holmes said gently. More likely he will attempt to destroy the last evidence of his guilt. The lake is a faithful confederate, but he shall find it less forgiving this time. By 8 o'clock the snow had ceased, leaving the air sharp as glass. Holmes and I took our place by the boathouse, the moon hanging low like a tarnished coin. The lake's surface gleamed, unbroken save for the faint depression where the ice thinned near the reeds, the spot Holmes had marked that morning. Within the boathouse, a lantern glowed faintly, its beam trained toward the house in mimicry of the old deceit. Holmes crouched beside it, adjusting the wick with the delicacy of a surgeon. The play repeats itself, Watson, he whispered. Observe how repetition unveils truth. A man who has succeeded once grows careless in success. From across the frozen meadow came the crunch of footsteps. A shadow detached itself from the trees, broad-shouldered, muffled in a cloak. It paused by the bank, the lantern's faint gleam outlining the brim of a hat. Then the figure advanced cautiously upon the ice, step by step, toward the false glow. Holmes's hand gripped my sleeve. Not yet. Let him commit himself. The man reached the reeds and stooped. A flash of metal caught the moonlight, perhaps a knife, perhaps a pistol. Holmes sprang forward with astonishing speed, his cry ringing across the stillness. "Draycott! The game is finished!" The figure whirled, slipped, and fell. The ice cracked like gunfire. I flung myself forward, seized Holmes's coat as he leaned dangerously close, and together we hauled the thrashing man toward the bank. The ice gave way beneath him. The water surged black and vicious. By desperate effort we dragged him clear. He collapsed upon the snow, coughing and shivering, his cloak clinging like seaweed. Holmes stood over him, breath misting in the cold. "You were the hand, Draycott. Fortescue was but the shadow. He sold what you devised. Captain Vane discovered your treason, and you silenced him beneath this very moon." Draycott glared upward, his teeth chattering. "You can prove nothing." Holmes stooped, drawing from the man's pocket a small brass seal, its face carved with a serpent, entwined with holly. "On the contrary," he said quietly, "I can prove everything." At that moment, lanterns bobbed across the field, Sir Geoffrey and the servants running at the sound of our struggle. Holmes pocketed the seal and turned to me. "Another midnight visitor come to grief, Watson. But this time the knocking will be done by justice itself." As we led the sodden officer back toward the house, the church clock struck 12 the hour. 1 year passed, when Captain Leonard Vane had walked to his death. Holmes glanced at the frozen lake behind us, its broken surface glinting faintly under the moon. "The snow remembers," he murmured, "but it is man who forgets, and therein lies the true tragedy." The following morning dawned pale and bitter. The frost laid thick across the estate like a shroud. The lake, now marked by ropes and lantern staves, looked less like a place of leisure, and more like a crime scene from a Greek tragedy. A stage that had hosted treachery and, ultimately, its own undoing. Holmes stood in the breakfast room, dry and composed, despite the harrowing ordeal of the night before. Draycott, now confined under the watch of 2 constables hastily summoned from the village, had said little since his capture. He sat in the small study near the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, his proud jaw set, though his eyes betrayed the fear of a man whose illusions had crumbled with the cracking ice beneath his feet. Mrs. Vane sat across from Holmes, her veil lowered again. She had not slept, but there was a steadiness in her posture that had not been there the previous day. Watson poured her a second cup of tea with a gentleness that seemed to reassure her more than any word could. Holmes placed the serpent holly seal upon the table, the final emblem of his arrogance. The murderer could not resist flourish even in crime, and yet that very vanity delivered him to us. The wax is rare, produced only by a small stationer on Brook Street. A batch of 3 seals was sold last November to Major Draycott. His attempt at theatrical terror was also a paper trail. She stared at the object with unblinking eyes. "He once sent me letters years ago sealed in gold. When Leonard returned from the Sudan, I begged Lionel to keep his distance. I never knew he hated him." Holmes's gaze turned briefly toward the window. Hatred is a patient thing when paired with envy. Draycott's ambition could not stomach Vane's rise, especially once the captain was entrusted with strategic plans and an audience at the War Office. Sir Geoffrey entered at that moment, his face lined with fatigue. Draycott refuses to speak further. He insists that Vane's death was an accident, that he merely meant to frighten him into silence. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the last refuge of cowards. The accidental death defense. Yet what of the lantern aimed at the thinnest ice? The notebook of Vane's suspicions, the coded entries, and the payment left at the quarry, none of it aligns with accident." Watson leaned forward. "Holmes, if I may, what of Fortescue?" He tried to shift suspicion, but was he truly Draycott's partner, or simply blackmailed into silence? "A pertinent question, Watson." Holmes tapped a finger on the table. "Fortescue had debts, gambling losses. Draycott offered him a share in the sale of the plans, likely with threats as incentive. Vane's discovery placed them both in danger. Fortescue lacked the stomach for blood, but he concealed evidence and lied to protect himself. The law will make its distinctions. Sir Geoffrey cleared his throat. "Scotland Yard is sending an inspector by noon. I trust you will speak with him, Mr. Holmes." "Gladly, though I shall let the evidence speak louder. The lake has whispered its secrets. Now it is the hands of the law to write them down." Miss Stone entered just then, a folded letter in her hand. Mrs. Keene found this in Major Draycott's room, unsent. She passed it to Holmes. It was addressed simply to C.V. and sealed with the same wax. He opened it carefully, scanning the lines. Holmes's brow furrowed slightly, and he passed it to Watson. It read, "Clara, you chose wrong, and in doing so cast my shadow into the fire. Vane would have destroyed me had I not struck first. What I did with purpose and without regret. But if the serpent knocks again this year, it is because your guilt summoned him, not mine." Watson set it down. "There is madness in that handwriting." "No," said Holmes. "There is coldness, a man's ego wounded by rejection and outranked in the only sphere he cared for. Yours." He turned back to Mrs. Vane. "He blames you for your husband's honor. The irony is, had you never come to me, he might have succeeded again." She did not respond immediately. Then, with a quiet resolution, she rose. "I came for truth, Mr. Holmes. I did not expect peace, but I am grateful for Leonard and for myself." Later that day, as the inspector gathered statements and Draycott was led away, Holmes and I stood once more upon the edge of the lake. The thaw had begun, a slow drip from the overhanging branches, the first signals of change. "I suppose justice has been served," I said. Holmes, ever inscrutable, lit his pipe. "Justice? Yes, but only barely. Vane died with his honor intact, yet the system that employed him did not protect him. It took a widow's footsteps in the snow to do that." He turned toward the house. "Come, Watson. Christmas awaits. And there is another widow in London who suspects her husband's ghost has taken to writing letters." And with that, we walked back through the snow, and the serpent's mark behind us, and another case closed beneath the winter sky. 2 days later, London had resumed its grim rhythm. The snow in the streets had turned to slush, and the gas lamps of Baker Street flickered beneath a low-hanging ceiling of soot-stained cloud. Inside 221B, however, warmth and activity reigned. The fire crackled cheerfully. Holmes was in one of his restless moods, pacing between the windows and the bookcase, violin in one hand, pipe in the other, both unused as his thoughts took precedence. I sat at the writing desk, my journal open before me, attempting to record the events of the past week while they remained fresh. Yet I found myself pausing frequently, not from lack of memory but from the curious weight that lingered over the resolution of the Vane affair. Justice had indeed been served, but the shadow it cast of military secrets, personal vendettas, and quiet grief was not so easily dispelled. Holmes stopped suddenly and turned toward me. "Watson, I've been considering the ash found upon the boathouse rail. Trichinopoly," I said, without looking up. "As you identified, yes. But consider Draycott's smoked Egyptian cigarettes. The Trichinopoly was Fortescue's indulgence. He was always the weaker link. It was not Draycott who waited at the boathouse that night, it was the Colonel." I laid down my pen. "But you said yourself that Draycott was the architect of the crime." "Indeed he was. He manipulated Fortescue, whose debts made him pliable. But the Colonel was the one who physically laid the trap, placed the lantern, burned the candle, smoked to calm his nerves. When Vane arrived and recognized the betrayal, it was Fortescue who fled in panic and let the ice claim him." Holmes crossed to the fire and leaned one elbow upon the mantel. I did not press the Colonel further. Draycott's guilt was clear and damning. There was no need to crush the remnants of a broken man. I studied Holmes. His decision surprised me. He was rarely one to allow sentiment to soften justice. "You pitied him." He gave a small shrug. "Pity, no. But I recognized in him a man already condemned not by law, but by conscience. He will drink himself to death within the year, if I judge him rightly. There was a silence, filled only by the ticking of the clock and the muted rattle of a hansom beyond the window. Holmes picked up a letter from the mantelpiece. Ah, and here is the post. A curious thing, Watson, a card from Mrs. Vane. I took it and read, Mr. Holmes, you have given me more than answers. You gave my husband his honor, and me the courage to go on living in truth. I return now to my father's house in Northumberland. If ever again someone knocks at my door in darkness, I will not face it alone. C. V. I folded the card and returned it to the mantel. She was brave, I said, and she acted when others would have remained silent. Holmes nodded. Women often perceive danger more keenly than men, though they are taught to dismiss it as imagination. Clara Vane trusted her instincts, and it saved her life. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a small tray. There's a gentleman downstairs asking to see you, Mr. Holmes. He won't give his name, but insists it's a matter of great urgency. Holmes looked at me, eyes sharpening with interest. Watson, you know how fond I am of a puzzle with tea. A few moments later, the door opened to admit a tall, gaunt man of about 60. His clothes marked with coal dust and oil. He held his cap in both hands, twisting it nervously. Mr. Holmes, he began, I come from the East London Rail Company. We've had 3 men disappear in the tunnel works near Whitechapel. Some say it's gas, some say it's rats. But the last man to go missing left a message scratched into the wall behind his station locker. Holmes sat forward. And what did it say? The man swallowed. It said, Don't follow the whistler. He walks beneath. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Holmes rose slowly, his whole frame taut with anticipation. Watson, he said, reaching for his coat. The Christmas widow gave us a crime of the heart, but I fear this next tale may test the very limits of reason. Come, the tunnels await. And with that, we descended once more into the dark. The journey to Whitechapel was made under a grim sky, the kind of low, leaden expanse that seemed to press down upon the very soul of the city. Smoke from chimney stacks mingled with the mist rising off the Thames, turning the air a choking grey. Holmes was unusually silent as our cab rattled through the narrower lanes east of Aldgate. The riddle of the message, Don't follow the whistler. He walks beneath, had taken root in his mind like ivy and stone, and I could sense the flurry of deductions assembling behind his pale eyes. We arrived at a modest station building tucked between a pawnbroker and a shuttered tea shop. It bore the faded paint of neglect and the unmistakable air of things half forgotten by the city above. Inside, a single gas lamp hissed weakly, casting a jaundiced glow over the cracked floor tiles. The railway official who had summoned us, Mr. Langley, met us at the edge of the platform. He was a man drawn taut by anxiety, his coat dusted with soot, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. This way, gentlemen, he said, his voice low, as if afraid to rouse something that slumbered nearby. We keep it locked now, the tunnel mouth. But before we did, men kept hearing it. Hearing what? Holmes asked. Langley's Adam's apple bobbed. A whistle, long and low, no tune to it. Just a sound that made the hair stand up on your arms. It never came from the same place twice. He led us to a rusted gate at the end of the platform, beyond which a steep iron stair descended into darkness. He unlocked it with a ring of keys that jangled like distant bells in the silence. As we stepped into the descending gloom, Holmes drew a lantern from beneath his coat and lit it with a match. Watson, observe the dust, he said softly. Few have passed this way since the last incident. A prudent decision. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a yawning artery of brick and shadow. The East London line, long plagued by budget delays and structural flaws, ran under these parts with minimal support. Piles of timber, broken crates, and buckets of ancient mortar littered the edges like skeletal remains of forgotten work. Langley motioned to a row of lockers mounted along the curved wall. "Number 14, he whispered, standing back. Holmes approached and opened it slowly. Inside was a coat old, stained with lime, and a pair of work gloves resting atop a worn prayer book. But the real interest lay behind. Holmes turned his lantern toward the rear panel, scratched deep into the wood, almost as if by a nail or the tip of a knife, were the words, "Don't follow the Whistler. He walks beneath." Holmes examined the lettering closely. "Recent. Days old, not weeks. The pressure is uneven, done quickly, likely in fear." He stepped back, eyes narrowing. "Tell me, Langley, of the 3 men who vanished, were any recovered?" "Only one," the man replied grimly. "Thomas Briggs. We found him halfway down the maintenance shaft that feeds into the old Roman drainage system. He'd been dead 2 days. No marks on him. But he was found curled up like a frightened child. No tools, no sign of a fall. Just dead. And the others? Gone. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just their lanterns found dimmed and smashed." Holmes walked slowly toward the shaft entrance. An iron-ringed hole in the side of the wall, just wide enough for a man to stoop into. He crouched, letting his lantern beam play along the bricks. Footprints, old but overlapping. "The cement here is uneven. 2, no 3 sets of boots, one of them dragging slightly." Then he paused. He tilted the lantern downward. In the narrow strip of sludge that lined the base of the shaft, something glittered faintly. He reached with the tip of his cane and drew it out a brass button, stamped with the insignia of the Metropolitan Police. Watson stepped forward. "A constable?" Holmes nodded. "Or someone masquerading as one. This opens a new page." He turned to Langley. "You must clear the station. No men are to enter the tunnels until I give word. Watson and I shall descend further. If I'm correct, the Whistler's secret lies not in sound, but in silence, and somewhere below." "He waits." Langley looked pale. "You're going down now?" Holmes smiled grimly. "Indeed, the Whistler walks beneath, and I, for one, intend to see where his footsteps end." And so, lanterns in hand, we descended once more into darkness, into silence, into a secret buried beneath London's oldest stones. The descent into the Roman shaft was a claustrophobic journey, each step steeped in damp silence. The air thickened around us, smelling of mildew, old brick, and something else, an acrid undercurrent, faint but insistent, like scorched cloth or distant oil. Holmes moved ahead, lantern held low, casting uneasy shadows along the curved walls. I followed close, revolver in pocket, heart quickening with every creak of ancient timber above our heads. The tunnel narrowed sharply after 30 yards, forcing us to stoop. Water dripped from iron rivets and trickled in thin streams across the floor, forming shallow, glinting channels. Holmes stopped and turned his light on a rusted iron support beam where faint gouges marred the surface. He touched them gently. "These are fresh, no more than a week old. Someone came through here dragging something heavy. See how the marks widen and swerve." He stood, and here note the white trace on the wall. Lime, likely from Briggs's coat. He passed this way. A soft gust of wind whispered through the shaft behind us, but there was no opening above. It was not a wind that moved in straight lines. It coiled, turned corners. Holmes froze. So did I. Then came the sound. A whistle, low and long. Not cheerful, not musical. A single unbroken note that pulsed with eerie precision. It echoed through the tunnel, not as noise, but as suggestion. One could not say where it came from, only that it was. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly. "Stand still," he whispered. "Don't speak. Don't move." In pitch darkness, we waited. The sound died, but the chill it left behind lingered. My hand found the cold grip of my revolver. I had faced many dangers with Holmes' gunmen, poisoners, madmen, but this was the first time I felt as if the darkness itself were watching us. After perhaps a full minute, Holmes relit the lantern. His face remained composed, but the line of his mouth was taut. "It's not natural," I said under my breath. "On the contrary, Watson. It is precisely calculated, artificial, but masterfully employed. The whistle is a psychological device, one meant to disorient, to unnerve, and ultimately to drive the listener away. Then, it's man-made? Oh, undoubtedly. The question is by which man? And for what purpose?" We pressed on, the tunnel dipping downward at a sharper angle. Soon the Roman brickwork gave way to rough stone, older, darker, less certain in structure. Holmes's lantern picked out symbols etched faintly into the stone graffiti, perhaps, or ritual marks long eroded by time. Then, as we turned a narrow bend, we entered a chamber. It was circular and unexpected, a kind of junction lost to all maps. The walls were lined with niches, some bricked in, others open. A broken oil lamp rested near a collapsed crate, and at the center of the floor was a round metal grate. Something about it felt wrong. Holmes knelt. "Recently disturbed. See the scuff marks along the rim. I have. Someone removed this within the past week." He lifted the grate carefully and peered into the void beneath. Another shaft, shallower, a drop of about 15 feet. He turned to me. "Give me your hand, Watson. Brace your legs against that groove. I'll lower myself. You can't be serious. I never joke in a murder tunnel." He smiled briefly and vanished below. Moments passed. Then his voice came softly. "Come down. Slowly. It's clear." I lowered myself with difficulty and found Holmes crouched in a narrow crawl space, barely 6 feet wide. At its end lay a crude wooden door, partially ajar. Inside flickered the faintest orange light. Holmes motioned me behind him and pushed the door open. The chamber beyond was small, dry, and hideously organized. Along the far wall stood racks of police uniforms, helmets, jackets, and false identification. A whistle lay on a crate beside a complex mechanical rig. Pipes fed into a bellows-like system attached to thin brass tubes, one of which led into the ceiling above. Holmes examined it. "A false whistler," he murmured. "Pneumatic. Operated remotely. Likely from above the tunnel mouth." "But why?" I asked. "Because," said Holmes, gesturing to the crates stacked neatly against the wall, "this tunnel is not a passage. It's a vault." He opened one of the crates. Inside were rows of copper canisters stamped with military emblems. I stared. Explosives? More than that. Stolen munitions. Enough to cripple a rail line or worse. And then we heard footsteps above, measured, slow, unmistakable. Someone else had entered the tunnel. The whistler was not done. Not yet. Holmes extinguished the lantern once more. The room fell into blackness so complete I could not see my own hand before my face. I heard him move beside me, calm and precise in the dark. "Stay still," he breathed. "He's above. If he hears us, he may flee, or worse, collapse the shaft." The footsteps overhead continued, a slow, deliberate pacing, as if the owner were marking time. Then the sound ceased. Silence fell again, not peaceful, but alert, listening. From above, a soft creak echoed a wooden beam under strain. Holmes pressed his fingers lightly to my arm. We waited. A faint metallic click sounded, followed by the unmistakable hiss of the pneumatic whistle being primed. Then came the sound again. The long, keening note that had haunted the tunnel, a mournful wail echoing down into the pit like a voice trying to call back the dead. Holmes leaned close to the rig. Even in darkness, I could feel the intensity of his focus. His fingers traced the tubing, following it to the floor where a narrow brass pipe ran beneath the crate of uniforms, disappearing into the stone. "This is the control system," he whispered. "Someone engineered the whistle to be projected into any chamber of the tunnel network. Psychological warfare. Watson enough to paralyze with fear those who dared descend too deep. But why go to such lengths?" Holmes answered by nudging the lid off the next crate. Even in the dark, I could feel the cold waft of metal and oil. He touched it briefly. "More munitions, shells. These aren't random thefts. This is coordinated." A low rumble vibrated through the stone. "Someone's moving machinery above," Holmes said, "likely preparing to close this section before we can return, if the shaft is sealed." He didn't finish the thought. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a length of waxed twine and a stub of chalk. With the chalk, he made a swift mark on the inner lip of the doorframe. Then he tied the twine tightly around the handle, knotting it twice and looping the slack over a small nail protruding from the frame. "What's that for?" I asked. "If we are sealed in," he said briskly, "this will signal whether the door has been disturbed from outside. But we won't be sealed in, not yet." He handed me the lantern and motioned toward the shaft we'd entered. "You go first. When you reach the top, signal me. If I do not follow within 30 seconds, proceed to Langley and inform him to alert Inspector Gregson." I resisted the urge to argue. I knew that tone in Holmes's voice, final, focused, absolute. He had begun to assemble the pieces of a far larger game, and I was now a single rook moved to safety while the king plotted checkmate. I climbed quickly, emerging into the cold air of the upper tunnel. The air was heavier now, thicker with soot. I turned back and whispered, "Now, Holmes." No answer. 10 seconds. 15. Then his voice floated up, low and urgent. "Hold fast, Watson. I hear breathing." Before I could reply, the shaft reverberated with a new sound, boots on stone, descending fast. Then a thud. Someone had dropped directly onto Holmes. I drew my revolver and peered down, but I could see nothing. A scuffle, a sharp grunt, then a flash, a flare of orange as Holmes's lantern flared to life. In the flicker, I saw them. Holmes pinned to the ground, his assailant cloaked in black, face hidden behind a scarf. One gloved hand was pressed to Holmes's throat, the other gripping a length of steel. I fired. The shot rang off the stone wall, narrowly missing. The man turned his head toward the shaft, giving Holmes the moment he needed. In a flash, Holmes twisted free, his legs sweeping the attackers from beneath him. The man struck the ground hard, and Holmes was on him, pressing the edge of the lantern into the man's throat. "Not another step," Holmes hissed. "Watson has a revolver, and I have questions." The man spat at the floor. "You won't leave this tunnel." "We already have," Holmes said calmly. "You'll be the only ghost down here tonight." Moments later, we bound the man's wrists with Holmes's cord and ascended together. The three of us, Holmes, myself, and the would-be killer emerging into the platform chamber. Langley gasped when he saw the prisoner. "By God," he whispered. "That's Inspector Mallon. Yard thought he died last year in the Limehouse fire." Holmes removed the scarf from the man's face. Beneath the soot and scars, the eyes gleamed cold and calculating. "Mallon didn't die," Holmes said. "He simply went underground." And now, with the mystery pierced and the truth clawing its way into the daylight, we knew the case was far from over. We returned to Baker Street late that evening, our prisoner handed over to Inspector Gregson under the cover of night. The Yard, reluctant as ever to air its own scandal, took Mallon into custody without ceremony. There would be no public trial. Not yet. The implications were too vast. A former inspector turned rogue, hiding beneath London's streets, orchestrating thefts, terrorizing workers, and storing enough explosives to bring down half the East End. Such truths had to be navigated carefully and with official gloves. Holmes sat in his chair now, a single lamp casting long shadows over his drawn face. He looked older than usual, as if the darkness of the tunnels had left its mark upon him more deeply than he cared to admit. The brass whistle Malin had used lay on the table between us, coiled tubing still smeared with soot. I broke the silence. "You knew it was him in the shaft?" Holmes nodded slowly. "I had suspected since the moment I saw the mechanical whistler. It was too refined, too precise. Malin had worked on signal design in the yard before his disgrace. He disappeared after the Limehouse arson, presumed dead. But no body was ever recovered. And the motive? Revenge, partly," Holmes replied, steepling his fingers. "But also power. Malin was a man humiliated by the system he once served. Stripped of authority, he built his own kingdom beneath the city, using fear to maintain control, and stolen military goods to fuel whatever rebellion he imagined." I leaned forward. "But how did he come by the explosives?" "Those canisters were genuine. War Office marked." "That," Holmes said grimly, "is the most troubling question of all. They were not stolen from transport depots or intercepted in transit. No, Watson, they were diverted. Someone in the supply chain, someone with access and clearance, has been feeding munitions into Malin's hands. This is not the work of one madman. There is a network, a design. Malin was merely its whispering mouth." I was silent. The idea that our city, our nation, could be undermined from beneath, both literally and figuratively, chilled me more than the December air ever could. Holmes rose and began to pace. "Consider the purpose of the whistle. It wasn't only to frighten superstitious workers. It served a larger purpose, to clear the tunnels, to keep the curious away. It was a barrier of fear, masking the movement of materials and men. Every vanished worker, every smashed lantern, every silent corner of that subterranean world, it was by design. And the men vanished?" Holmes paused. "One likely saw too much. Another may have stumbled upon a transfer. And poor Briggs. I believe he recognized the uniform. Malin may have once been his superior. The shock, the fear, it killed him before the tunnel could." We sat in silence then, each of us staring into the fire, listening to the faint hiss of the gas lamp and the occasional creak of the floorboards above. Outside, the city passed on unaware, wheels turning, chimneys smoking, footsteps pattering over flagstones far removed from the silent war beneath their feet. "Finally," I said, "so what now? Do we follow it up? Hunt the rest of the network?" Holmes looked at me, and for a moment I saw something rare weariness. "No," he said softly. "Not yet. We've unmasked the voice. But the body remains hidden. If we move too quickly, they will vanish again into steam, into soot, into the forgotten places no map dares to name." He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Snow was falling again, soft and slow. "Let the city sleep for now. There are nights when justice must wait its hour." Then, with sudden briskness, he turned. "Besides, I have a telegram from Lestrade about a corpse found in Regent's Park, torn from the lake. The feet are bare, but the shoes were neatly placed beside the body. That kind of flourish, Watson, suggests either poetry or madness, and I confess I'm intrigued by both." I rose and reached for my coat. "Then shall we?" Holmes smiled. "To Regent's Park, then." And so we departed once more, out into the falling snow, the echoes of the whistler still lingering in memory, but fading beneath the rhythm of boots on cobblestone, the only sound, now, that mattered.